What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. This is my updated top 5 rookie sleepers or late round values in rookie drafts. This week, we're bringing you a lot of sleeper type content. Last week, we talked about, our rankings and a lot of mock drafts and stuff like that. So today, we're going through my top 5 rookie sleepers, basically third and fourth round rookie picks that could pay off big time. Danny is going to be doing a UDFAs video tomorrow. So once your rookie draft is over, there's going to be a lot of rookies left over. Who should you be prioritizing and who should you be picking up? And then on Wednesday, both of us are going to come together and we're going to give you the best late round players to pick in your startup. So if you started a Dynasty startup right after the NFL draft, you're probably nearing the point right now where there's a bunch of bad players that you can't really figure out who to pick. We're going to help you sort through some of those late round guys and talk about who has some upside later in those drafts and who could pay off big. So was hoping to get to, this video to you guys a little earlier for your rookie drafts, but nonetheless, as I mentioned, the players on this list will have a rookie draft ADP of round 3 or later. So probably rounds 3, 4, 5 per DLF. In your rookie drafts, you basically should be targeting the type of guys that can pay off really big at this point in the draft, right? Because if you miss on a first or second round pick in your rookie draft, let's say you pick Jamar Chase in the first round and he totally busts, and you miss on Amon-Ra St. Brown in the second round and he totally busts, that's going to set your dynasty roster back big time. But if you hit on those early round picks and you prioritize hitting on those early round picks, and then in rounds 3, 4, and 5, you can just swing for the fences and hope for the next Chase Claypool, the next Antonio Gibson, the next Terry McLaurin, all of whom were third round rookie picks, then you can really put yourself in an advantage in your dynasty roster, because your foundational picks, first and second round, those are the picks you want to be hitting on, taking a little bit less risk, so to speak. And then third and fourth and fifth round picks is when you can really swing for the fences. And this is basically how NFL GMs think as well, right? Because if an NFL GM can hit on their first and second round picks, they're usually going to be building a great team. And if they miss other third, fourth, and fifth round picks, no one's like, oh, fire this guy. He missed on his fourth rounder. Like, no, that's not really how it works. So we're going to hit the intro, and then we're going to get into the first guy here. A quick recap from last video, if you missed it. I want to give a quick update on the top 5 guys and some of the honorable mentions that I talked about last time. So Tamorrion Terry, as you guys know, was the thumbnail of that video. He actually went undrafted. It turns out he had a lot of off-the-field concerns. Maybe it was some attitude issues. He didn't really love the game or whatever. It may have had some validity knowing that he went undrafted. He lands with the Seahawks as a UDFA, could compete for a job in Seattle, but it's probably an uphill battle for him. I almost hope he gets cut, to be honest, after a good preseason, and then maybe lands with another team with a little bit more opportunity for growth within that receiving core, because I think the Seahawks is kind of crowded, especially with them taking a receiver in the second round this past year with Dwayne Eskridge. So another guy that I talked about was Khalil Herbert. He went to the Bears in round 6. Another kind of crowded situation, much like Tamorrion Terry. He'll probably only get on the field in the case of an injury to either David Montgomery or to Tariq Cohen. Tariq Cohen is actually signed through 2023. So he has some dead cap in the next few years. So he's probably not a guy like Khalil Herbert, that is. He's probably not a guy that you're going to be looking towards, because it's really going to only be in the case of injury that he's valuable. So a guy to keep an eye on if he goes undrafted in your rookie draft, but not a guy I would spend a draft pick on. And then thirdly, Hunter Long was a guy I discussed in depth last video. In my opinion, he's still a mid-third rounder, like I said he was in that video. Third tight end off the board in the NFL draft, went to the Miami Dolphins. He's firmly entrenched as the future of that position. As we know, Mike Gesicki is a pending UFA after this season, which I said would be a situation that could benefit Long in that video. I said if he could sit behind a guy that's maybe in a contract year or something like that, any older tight end that you have on your dynasty roster, whether it's Kelsey, Waller, Gronkowski, something like that, he's the perfect type of tight end for you to grab in the third round. Throw him on your taxi squad his rookie season, and then, wheels up after Mike Gesicki is moved on from the Dolphins. And then I also briefly talked about Davis Mills and Kellen Mond in that video. I said you should pay attention to their draft capital and their landing spot, because both of those guys had some upside as fantasy quarterbacks. It's a mixed bag with both guys. I would say Mills is probably going to play as soon as this year. But if you ask me, like from a team building perspective, Houston really just wasted that pick, because if Watson's gone, and which the belief from connected people around the league is that he will be gone, Mills would really, really have to impress them for them to not draft a quarterback very high in next year's draft, because they're on pace to be probably a top 5 pick overall team. And when you're picking that high, you're usually looking for a quarterback. So that's a tough thing to ask of a guy like Davis Mills, who had limited starts in college, to come in and compete with Tyrod right away and potentially win out that job and show them something in his rookie year, because he just really didn't have the college resume to be well prepared for a situation like that. Kellen Mond and some of the other guys that I mentioned in that previous video made the list again, but I'm going to get into the newer guys first. So for those of you that may not know some of these new guys, I'm going to get into those guys first in this list. But Kellen Mond actually did make this top 5 list, as did some of the other guys that were in the previous video. So number 1, the first guy that we're going to be talking about is Josh Palmer, wide receiver from the Los Angeles Chargers. 28th overall pick, wide receiver 13, about an early 3rd rounder in both one quarterback and super flex formats. So he's kind of teetering on the border of a guy that can be making this list. But for those of you guys that don't know Josh Palmer is a relative unknown probably to most fantasy players, because he's not a flashy name. He did play in the SEC, but he didn't go to Alabama or Ohio State or anything, a big school like that. So he played for the University of Tennessee, where he had an up and down collegiate career, to say the least. If you look at his production, it's not Jamar Chase, it's not Devontae Smith, but he did lead his team in receiving by a wide margin this past year. I believe he had 480 yards and 4 touchdowns. The next closest guy was like 230 yards. So he did dominate his production this past year. This was actually the first year that Palmer didn't have Saints wide receiver Marquez Callaway and 49ers wide receiver Jawan Jennings to compete with, both of whom have seen NFL reps. So they're NFL caliber receivers, but they're not necessarily to the level that Palmer was drafted at. He was a 3rd round pick by the Chargers. So he finished 3rd in receiving in 2019 on the Tennessee Volunteers and 2nd in 2018. So he has been productive over his collegiate career, but the passing offense for Tennessee in general has not yielded raw numbers that jump off the page, right? He didn't have an 1,000-yard sophomore season like De'Ami Brown or Elijah Moore. He was more so good production relative to his offense, but not good production overall. So from a production standpoint, Palmer definitely had some struggles due in large part to the quarterback play at Tennessee. But on film, if you actually watch this guy play, he has some very desirable traits for a pro receiver. He plays a lot like Marquise Lee, in my opinion. Physical, solid route runner, good in contested situations, and a pretty good athlete as well. He has the ceiling, and the Chargers probably saw that at the Senior Bowl, where he really showed well and prompted them to make Palmer a 3rd round selection in the NFL draft. Because I think had Palmer not gone to the Senior Bowl, or maybe he was injured for the Senior Bowl or something like that, he really improved his draft stock there. And you're probably talking about a 5th to 7th round type of receiver, as opposed to the 3rd rounder that he was actually selected as. And this year, in terms of the Los Angeles Chargers situation, Palmer enters a crowded receiving room, even with Hunter Henry's departure at the tight end position. Mike Williams is still there. You still have Keenan Allen there, obviously. And then a few guys that showed late last year with Jalen Guyton and Teron Johnson and stuff like that. But Mike Williams is set to be a UFA after this year, because he's currently playing on his 5th-year option. The selection of Palmer by the Chargers indicates to me that they're not interested in paying Mike Williams. And if he has a blow-up contract year, especially like Corey Davis did this past year, they'll probably just let him walk in free agency unless he's really willing to sign for cheap, which probably won't happen, because Williams is a former top 10 pick receiver. So he'll probably get overpaid regardless in free agency, especially with the cap going up next year. So Palmer can step in year 2 of his NFL career and potentially compete for the number 2 target in that offense, number 2 receiver for sure, with only really Austin Eckler and Keenan Allen as impact targets at that point in the offense. And we know when you have a quarterback like Justin Herbert, and the type of quarterback that I believe Justin Herbert can be, he can really elevate the play of those around him. And if you get a guy who's talented and raw like Josh Palmer is, he can make him very fantasy relevant. We saw Justin Herbert make Jalen Guyton and Teron Johnson relevant last year, both of whom are undrafted free agents. So we could definitely see Palmer come in and perform the back end of his rookie year. Let's say he comes in and he's got a little bit of a down first part of the season, but maybe he's like a hot waiver wire ad second half of the season, because we know Mike Williams, of course, is very injury prone as well. So there's a chance he gets on the field a little earlier than I'm anticipating. But at the very least, he's going to increase his value going into year 2 if you wanted to sell him in a dynasty league. Because if Mike Williams does move on, you're looking at a situation where fantasy owners are going to be like, oh yeah, this guy's the number 2 in the offense, whether he's shown enough or not. And they're just going to immediately be willing to buy that guy, especially if they have a guy like Justin Herbert on their roster. Maybe they're looking for a stack or something like that. So Josh Palmer is a guy that I'm absolutely willing to invest in the mid-3rd round probably range. He's a guy that has some upside. He has a Marquise Lee type frame type of skill set. And he could be, honestly, I think the way they could use him is more of like a big slot, but You obviously have Keenan Allen there, so you could kind of interchange those guys as an offense. But nonetheless, Josh Palmer is a guy that needs to be on your radar. He's a guy that has some upside. But to the next guy that we're going to be talking about here, and that's Dez Fitzpatrick, wide receiver for the Tennessee Titans. He was a 4th-round pick. He's currently going off the board, wide receiver 17, 37 overall in Superflex leagues, 36 overall in one quarterback league. So you're talking about a guy that is a late 3rd, early 4th round type of turn pick. The big allure for Tennessee drafting a wide receiver early, like Elijah Moore, Rashad Bateman, a lot of these bigger name receivers, we wanted to go to Tennessee. And the reason was because the vacated production coming from the departure of Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith, most notably, but also from Adam Humphries and Khalif Raymond, they were pretty much losing all of their receiving core. Like, if you actually go back and look at last year's receiving stats, Derrick Henry is currently the 3rd leading receiver that's currently still on the team right now. And Derrick Henry is a guy we all know that doesn't give you anything in the receiving game. So Dez Fitzpatrick is walking into a situation with a lot of production up in the air. And yeah, A.J. Brown's going to see a production uptick, but he can't get everything, right? Like, he's not going to get the ball on every single play when they pass the ball. Corey Davis vacates 92 targets, nearly 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns. And Jonnu vacates 65 targets, 448 yards and 8 touchdowns. And they did not add a tight end to this team. So Dez Fitzpatrick's definitely in an ideal situation from that perspective. They didn't choose to draft a wide receiver as early as we would have wanted. I know I personally wanted Elijah Moore to go there and reunite with his old teammate, A.J. Brown, but they selected Dez Fitzpatrick with the 4th pick of the 4th round ahead of a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who were already drafting in the 2nd round. So we know that the draft capital is adequate enough to indicate that Fitzpatrick may be in line for a decent role. Fitzpatrick is a guy that has a lot of physical ability, right? But not a lot of refinement to his game. I talked about Tamorrion Terry in the last video, talking about his game being a lot of physical ability, but not a lot of refinement. Fitzpatrick has a similar game, and why I would have much preferred Tamorrion Terry to land in this landing spot and get drafted to this team. But at least they drafted a guy of a similar mold. Fitzpatrick is about the same size as Tamorrion Terry, 6'2", 208 pounds, physical receiver. He's great deep down the field at the catch point. He had some issues with drops and is a bit of an older prospect at 23 and a half, but he had inconsistent production. Nonetheless, he still has a big ceiling. He tested very well. He ran a 4.46. He had 70 plus percentile jumping scores and agility scores. So this year he was able, from a production standpoint, to command a 25% target share of the Louisville offense and almost 1/3 of the team's receiving yards. And remember, they had Tutu Atwell, who was also on that team, get drafted in the 2nd round. And Dez Fitzpatrick kind of widely outproduced him. And he also had Javian Hawkins in the backfield, who was commanding some targets as well. So Dez Fitzpatrick competed with 2 NFL caliber players, and he was able to establish himself as the number 1 in that offense. And the fact that Tutu Atwell was a 2nd round pick was probably a good thing for Dez Fitzpatrick. It probably got more eyes on him when teams were watching Tutu Atwell. They were probably like, who is this other guy who's number 7 on Louisville? He's probably even a better prospect, in my opinion, than Tutu Atwell is. So keep an eye on Dez Fitzpatrick. He's a guy that definitely could step into a big-time role with Tennessee. Tennessee cannot throw the ball to A.J. Brown on every single play. And yes, they could add a veteran receiver at some point. They did add Josh Reynolds in free agency, but Josh Reynolds, I mean, he's good. He's a solid receiver, but he's not a great receiver. So if Dez Fitzpatrick comes out and impresses in training camp, impresses in the preseason, we could be talking about a guy that's maybe this year's Darius Slayton. Remember how solid Darius Slayton was his rookie year? We could see a guy like Dez Fitzpatrick come into probably a better situation in terms of an offense and a quarterback play and the receiver on the opposite side of him. And he could come in and potentially have like an 800-yard, 5-touchdown type of rookie season, which would be really good for a guy that you got in the early 4th round of a rookie draft. So to the next guy that we're going to be talking about, we're going to switch to the quarterback position. As I mentioned, Kellen Mond already. He's currently going off the board at quarterback 8, 33 overall, a late 3rd round super flex pick. So in a super flex league, we all know that quarterbacks are very valuable, right? We're just looking for quarterbacks that are starting. And Kellen Mond was a guy that was always going to be interesting because of the skill set that he has. He has I don't want to call him Dak Prescott, but that type of appeal where you could come into the team and sit behind a veteran for a bit and eventually take over the starting job. And because you have the ability to use vast arm talent and ability on the ground, running the ball and stuff like that, you could be a very interesting fantasy asset. So he was a guy that was interesting even before the draft. And now that he's been drafted, he's a guy that I find myself very interested in. And the reason I say very interested is because he got early 3rd round draft capital, right? He was the 2 picks after Kyle Trask, who was the late 2nd round pick. Situation very similar to the Philadelphia Eagles last year. A quarterback they once had faith in Kirk Cousins, kind of compared to Carson Wentz. hasn't necessarily translated to playoff success. Obviously, Carson Wentz had great regular season numbers, but he wasn't able to do it in the playoffs, mostly because of injury and things of that nature. But Kirk Cousins is a guy who stays healthy, just can't perform in the clutch, right? He won a playoff game against the Saints a couple of years ago, but that's pretty much the extent of the playoff success they got from Kirk Cousins. And the reason, if you think back to 2017, the reason they went out and got a quarterback upgrade from Case Keenum to Kirk Cousins that year was because they lost in the NFC Championship game. They thought Kirk Cousins was the piece that could, bring them over the hump. And Kirk Cousins has been kind of anything but that when it comes to the playoffs. Again, he's been good in the regular season, but up and down play and kind of, they probably feel like they're in quarterback purgatory right now. And Cousins might be on thin ice with the Vikings. Last year when the Jalen Hurts pick happened, I somewhat shrugged it off, I would say, and thought they would never move Wentz due to the extension that they gave him, right? We saw going back to last year, people were talking about Carson Wentz's contract situation. Well, Jalen Hurts isn't going to take over the job because they can't move Carson Wentz. The amount of dead money that he has is just not possible. But as we saw with both Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, sometimes when a front office wants to replace you that bad, they'll find a way, right? They'll restructure your contract. They'll eat some of that dead money. They'll just get rid of you. And I'm not saying that Kirk Cousins is a goner, right? I'm not saying he's going to be done after this year, but as soon as the Vikings slip up, either this year or maybe next year, because Kirk Cousins is only signed through next year, I think Kellen Mond gets a shot at the starting job. And if he can impress the coaches, maybe throughout practice and training camp and preseason, maybe he'll build up some buzz that way. Mond as a player has the Jalen Hurts framework as well. Great intangibles, great physical tools, but the accuracy and the mechanical part of the game probably needs refining, and that'll come with NFL coaching and more experience. And we know Kellen Mond as a quarterback in college had a lot of experience starting games, which is important to NFL teams. They want to know if they're putting a guy out there, it's not Davis Mills who started 11 games. It's not Mac Jones who started 14 games or whatever. It's Kellen Mond who started over 40 games in college. He has a lot of experience starting, and an NFL team can feel comfortable throwing him out there because he's not some, fresh new face that's never, taken a snap under center before. NFL teams do not lie during the draft. And that's the reason I like Kellen Mond so much. I would not be shocked if Mond is a bigger factor in the Vikings plan going forward, especially if they struggle next year to win games or make that leap to a contender, because the Vikings have always been stuck in the past 3 or 4 years in that 9-7, 10-6, maybe 8-8 type of range. And if they think Kellen Mond is the type of quarterback that can bring them over the top, and that'll come with buzz and his practice ability and his preseason and stuff like that, they won't just assume that after the draft pick. They'll need to see him actually perform in practice, and maybe Kirk Cousins struggle a little bit. But don't be shocked if they make the transition either this year or next year from Cousins to Mond, and they might even be willing to move Kirk Cousins in the process. So starting QBs, as I mentioned, they're a scarce resource in Superflex, and Mond has everything he needs to make an impact from a fantasy perspective with his ability to make things happen with his feet. So don't discount Kellen Mond. Don't just think, oh, well, Kirk Cousins is there, Kirk Cousins will hold him off. The front office didn't lie when they drafted him, right? They don't just waste third-round picks. They're a smart team. They're a smart organization. They're not just going to draft a guy to never use him. They have a plan for the guy, whether it's next year, the year after, whatever. Kirk Cousins isn't under contract forever, so keep Kellen Mond, an eye on Kellen Mond, especially if you're a rebuilding team too, because you could be sitting on Kellen Mond as an asset for a year or two, and he might not get any starting experience if Kirk Cousins performs well. So the next guy we're going to be getting into, the last two guys we're going to be getting into, were in the first video. So if you want a more in-depth breakdown of their film and their stylistic play type, you can go back and watch them in that video. But Nico Collins is the fourth guy that I'm going to be talking about on this list. He was the, I believe he was the 80-something overall pick by the Houston Texans in the third round of the NFL draft. He's currently going off the board as a 25th overall pick in Superflex drafts, wide receiver 12 ADP. So he is literally the first pick of the third round. According to DLF, he's really teetering on that border of a third-round pick to qualify for this list. But I talked about him in the other video. Collins is an absolute height, weight, speed guy that was mainly affected the deep areas of the field during his time at Michigan, right? He was a lot like Tamorrion Terry. He had kind of questionable hands, not a lot of route running ability, a little bit raw as a prospect. And as Michigan players often do, he failed to reach that monster high school prospect rating that he had coming out of high school and produce at an elite level in college. And the reason for that probably being Shea Patterson. But much like Donovan Peoples-Jones, who was his former teammate, the Texans took a shot on this talented athlete in the mid rounds of the NFL draft, spending the 26th pick of round 3 on him. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding this franchise right now, right? And we don't know what's going to happen with Deshaun Watson. The reason Collins will probably slip a little bit in your rookie drafts is warranted because they don't know what the quarterback situation is. this could be a team that we're talking about right now that could have the number 1 overall pick next year. So you don't really necessarily want to tie yourself to that kind of situation. But if there's a 20% chance that the Deshaun Watson legal situation is over soon and he's suspended for a bit but remains the Texans quarterback, you could be absolutely stealing his future number 1 receiver if everything breaks right. Now, 20% could even be a high projection. That might only be a 5% chance of happening, because it seems like everybody that knows anything about the NFL is saying that Watson's gone in Houston, whether this legal situation wraps itself up soon or not. He's never going to play another snap for them. So if that happens, we're talking about a guy that will develop for a rebuilding Texans franchise and maybe in a year, maybe 2 years, be tied to a top 5 overall pick rookie quarterback instead once he gets his stride in the NFL. So this is a long-term asset. This is not a guy that I expect to come out and produce right away, even though he does have some kind of open targets in his offense, right? Because Will Fuller is now gone. It's really just Brandon Cooks and Randall Cobb there. Nico Collins could get on the field and produce early. However, I expect him to struggle early because that's the type of prospect he was. He was more of a raw prospect, more of a developmental prospect, and they did hire a wide receivers coach as their head coach. So they should be able to develop this guy. And if the Watson situation is no problem for this year, he can reach his full potential, and he could absolutely be a Chase Claypool of this year, because Chase Claypool was a very similar type of prospect. He was a raw guy, went to a good situation, a situation that was able to develop receivers well, as we know the Steelers are able to do. And if he's somehow tied to Deshaun Watson, if Deshaun Watson somehow stays in Houston, you could be talking about a monster ceiling for this guy. And he could be the next, Will Fuller or whoever else you want to think of when tied to Deshaun Watson. I don't think he's got DeAndre Hopkins type upside, but he could definitely be the next Will Fuller. So I would gladly take this shot on Nico Collins over some of the guys that are going around the same area as him, like Amari Rodgers, Dwayne Eskridge, Tutu Atwell in this range, because with those guys, you really need scheme touches for them, because they're small slot receivers that they don't really have diverse route trees. They can't really affect the deep game of the field. So what you really need out of those kind of guys is scheme touches, jet sweeps, and screen passes and stuff like that. And you're putting your faith solely in the hands of a coaching staff with players like that. Whereas Nico Collins, I think, could actually develop into an X receiver that is a complete receiver. He just needs time to do so. So if you're looking for an upside swing, if you're a rebuilding team especially, take your shot on Nico Collins. It could absolutely pay off big for you. So Elijah Mitchell, he was the 6th round pick of the San Francisco 49ers, running back from the Louisiana Lafayette Ragin' Cajuns, RB9 currently in rookie drafts, 34 overall in Superflex drafts. Now, again, if you want a full breakdown of Elijah Mitchell, it's in the First Sleepers video. I talked about his film. I talked about, his situation at Louisiana Lafayette and why maybe he had some concerns that he did. But the gist of it is that he's a guy who can do it all, right? He can run the ball well. He has good vision. He has good patience. He is physical. He can catch the ball decently. He didn't have a lot of receiving production, but when he did catch the ball, he was good. And he had a 20 reception season. So he did have some receiving production. And then pass blocking, he was pretty solid in this area, very physical, just needed some technical refinement. But he really showed his athletic potential at his pro day this year. And that's what really made me rethink Elijah Mitchell, because he was a guy I thought was a little bit of a plotter. But once he actually tested, once he got up, he was running like a 4.3 at his pro day, and he was jumping well, and everything kind of lined up for him from an athletic standpoint to think that this guy actually has some real upside. So he's not elite in any one area, but he is solid all around as a player. And I know they traded up to take Trey Sermon, right? I'm not ignoring that. Trey Sermon was a 3rd round pick, but here's why I like Mitchell. Number one, he actually had a higher film grade for me, right? Between him and Trey Sermon, I actually had a higher grade on Elijah Mitchell. And I know the NFL teams obviously didn't, because Elijah Mitchell went in the 6th round and Trey Sermon went in the 3rd round. But from my own talent perspective, my own talent evaluation perspective, I'm willing to bet on Elijah Mitchell because I actually had a higher grade on him. Second, Kyle Shanahan runs a multi-back system, right? We've known this for a while. It usually has 2, sometimes 3 fantasy relevant running backs over the course of an entire season. So even if Trey Sermon is the number 1 back on that team, Elijah Mitchell will be valuable to some extent, whether it's as a handcuff, whether it's a low-end flex play, maybe he's an RB2 or something like that. So just because of the Kyle Shanahan system in general, it's a multi-back system. Elijah Mitchell could be a valuable piece just from that perspective in a dynasty league. And if we know anything about Kyle Shanahan and his running backs, he doesn't care where you came from. He doesn't care how you got there. If you're the best guy for whatever job he has in mind for you, you will get it. So if Elijah Mitchell goes to that team and he's the best receiving back on the team, he doesn't care that Raheem Mostert's making a lot of money. He doesn't care that Trey Sermon was a highly drafted player. He will put Elijah Mitchell as his 3rd down back because that's how Kyle Shanahan operates. And same goes for the early down role. If Elijah Mitchell's the better runner than Trey Sermon, and what I think is true, then Elijah Mitchell will get more of the carries than Trey Sermon will. He's not afraid to admit that Trey Sermon was overdrafted and Elijah Mitchell was maybe the better value. We've seen the situation play out before in other backfields. We've seen it play out in his own backfield. He had a UDFA in Raheem Mostert who had bounced around journeyman type of running back to a bunch of different teams. And he started Raheem Mostert over Jerick McKinnon, who was a guy that was at the time a top 8 or 6 paid running back at the position. So Kyle Shanahan isn't afraid to do this. Just because Elijah Mitchell was a 6th round pick, sure, it would disqualify him in a lot of other backfields, but this is a different situation. This is Kyle Shanahan. He operates differently. I have to respect the draft capital that the 49ers gave Sermon. I realize that. But at the same time, it's not like a late 3rd round pick that they spent on Trey Sermon is a 1st round running back who's guaranteed work, right? Sermon needs to earn it also. As a 3rd round pick, usually what a 3rd round type of running back is a developmental starter or a guy that will compete for a starting job. We've seen with guys like Royce Freeman in the past that a 3rd rounder and a 2nd rounder can be a big difference. It could be the difference between you competing for the job and losing versus you outright getting the job and having to fail on your own. Because usually with a 2nd round pick, they'll just give you the job. And if you fail, then you fail. But with a 3rd round pick, if you're not able to, take the job by the balls, so to speak, and run away with it, then you just won't get it at all. And that could happen with Trey Sermon. If he struggles at all, that could happen. So there's a good chance after this year as well, from a dynasty perspective, Mitchell fits this scheme very well in the mold of the Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert type because he has that speed that he showed at his pro day. And both Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson are free agents after this season. So there's a good chance that even if Mitchell isn't involved this year, him and Sermon are the only 2 running backs in this backfield next year that are, have some kind of draft capital invested in them. And if all things were equal, right? If we're talking no draft capital or whatever, I will take Trey Sermon over Elijah Mitchell as the more likely back to succeed from a fantasy perspective. But if you're asking, would I rather spend a late 1st round pick in a rookie draft or a early 2nd round pick in a rookie draft on Trey Sermon, or would I rather spend a late 3rd rounder on Mitchell, given the fact that I think they're pretty similar from a talent perspective, and this is a Kyle Shanahan backfield and it's unpredictable, I will take the value any day of the week. I will take Mitchell over Sermon any day of the week from a value perspective because I consider him more talented, plus all of the other factors I just outlined. Crazier things have happened. We've seen a small school prospect like Aaron Jones back in 2017 come out and beat out the higher drafted Jamal Williams within the same draft class in Green Bay a few years ago. So it's happened before. I think it could happen again. He's, in my opinion, the more talented back. I'm snagging Mitchell in the mid rounds of every single draft because, frankly, he's the only running back in this, rookie draft 3rd or 4th round range that I actually think has any kind of upside because Chuba Hubbard is a good prospect. He was a guy that was rated ahead of Mitchell for me pre-draft, but he landed behind Christian McCaffrey. Like what do we expect out of this guy aside from handcuff value? So all the running backs in this range, Ramondre Stevenson and Kenneth Gainwell, like I'll pass. I'll just take Elijah Mitchell where I can get him and just take receivers ahead of those running backs and tight ends and stuff like that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, this sleeper breakdown. Hopefully you still have some rookie drafts left that you can take advantage of some of this advice. Make sure you go out and snag some of the guys that I talked about here. Danny's going to be coming at you guys tomorrow with UDFAs, rookie draft UDFAs that you can go out and pick up. Some of them might be UDFAs from the actual NFL draft. Some of them just might be late round picks that didn't get drafted in your rookie drafts. But nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Like, comment, subscribe. If you are new, check out the draft guide, Rookie and Dynasty draft guide, only $15 at thefantasystockexchange.com. Peace out, guys, and enjoy your Monday.